And as you look at these two rocks, what do you notice about them? One's smooth. What did you say?
Different color, with darker.
Yep. Colors. Are the colors in each rock kind of the same kind of colors? They just look a little different? Yeah. So, which of these rocks do you think is older? Why do you think so?
It's being worn down by time.
Been more worn down by time. Anyone else want to add anything to that? People tend to agree with that? Anyone want to disagree? You're allowed to disagree. Truth of the matter is, they're probably the exact same age. All right. See, this is why you don't just follow along. Think for yourselves. Note to self. Think for yourselves. So, what would have caused? So the rock itself. I mentioned earlier that some of the rocks we're going to be looking at will have formed over 600 million years ago. So this rock likely formed around 600 million years ago, as did this one. So what would have caused this difference between these two different rocks?
Maybe one was buried and one was exposed.
All right, say more about, which one do you think was exposed?
The smooth.
And so what, so say more about that.
It was probably on top of something, and just with wind and weathering, it just would smooth out.
Wind and weathering smooth out. What other things might smooth out a rock? You mentioned wind. Friction. So say more about that.
If the things around it keep moving, it kind of make it.
So where might you envision a rock doing this? What might it do this in? Water. All right. Water, wind, ice. Those are all things that are going to act on rocks. And so this one has probably been swept along in a stream, tumbled around, and smoothed out. This one may have just broken off its original rock formation recently. They're the same age. This one just has more stories to tell. This has gone through more things. Which kind of gets us to the big ideas that students investigate during this geology unit. And there's the big three of weathering, erosion, and deposition. So taking these things one at a time. The first thing I'm going to talk a little bit about is weathering. Now, a lot of people think weathering and they think the weather. In geology, weathering are those forces that are going to wear down or break apart rock. What kinds of things could wear down and break apart rock?
Warming and cooling.
Warming and cooling can. So certainly if the sun's baking on a rock during the day and then it cools at night, kind of contraction and expansion. What else is going to break down a rock and break it apart?
Like water rushing by it, or
Exactly. Just forces of nature. So I'm going to put my rocks away so I don't forget them. So weathering are those processes by which rocks are broken down and worn. So there are three major kinds of weathering that can happen: mechanical, chemical, and biological. Mechanical is what we've just talked about: water, wind, ice. Water gets down into a crack and freezes, and water is one of those unusual substances that actually expands when it freezes. It doesn't contract. So water gets into a crack and then freezes. It gets a little bit bigger. It put pressure on the rock. It melts. It freezes. It melts. It's going to start moving apart the rock. Another type of ice that could actually affect rock would be our glaciers. So imagine, we talked about the glaciers came from the northwest and traveled southeast. As they're going along, they're kind of, all that little loose debris is getting frozen into it. They're breaking, it's pulling off chunks of rock. Things are getting carried along with it. And then it hits a piece of rock that is actually part of the bedrock, part of the crust of the earth that's exposed to the surface. It's not going anywhere. It's connected. So it just has to go up over the top of it. I want us to take a moment to look at this rock. And I just want you what are some things you notice about this rock? And again, there's no wrong answers here because you notice the things you see. So whatever you notice, you notice.
smooth.
Very smooth. Sorry?
Those green spots.
Green spots. It's got these green spots all over it. Interesting, yeah, it's got these green spots. But it also has these spots here. Do these spots look like those spots over there? How do they look different?
This looks like more in the rock. whereas
This looks
those
like it's
look
more in the rock and that's
like older from this.
on top of the rock? All right. A quick side note about this rock. We're not focusing anymore on the types of rocks and how rocks form, but it is kind of interesting to think about this rock and what it represents. This is a type of rock called volcanic breccia. And this is actually evidence that there was once a volcano here in Wellesley. Who knew? So, during an erupting volcano, and there is a graphic of this in your packet. During an erupting volcano, the volcano starts spewing out all its ash and rocks and all sorts of stuff. And eventually, the lava comes up and flows out. And quick side note, here's back to your old Earth history from 8th grade. What do we call the hot, molten, melted rock when it's below the surface of the Earth? Magma. What do we call the magma when it comes up and hits the surface of the Earth? Lava, exactly. All right, so we've got all this melted magma down here. It starts flowing up, and it's flowing up through existing bedrock. As it's flowing up as part of the erupting volcano, it's breaking off pieces of that surrounding bedrock that get swept up into the lava. That's what we're seeing here. These are pieces of the rock that the lava was flowing up through. Now, here's an analogy I like to make. If you've ever made chocolate chip cookies, when you first take the cookies out of the oven, if you let them cool, that chip keeps its nice chip shape. But if you take that cookie while it's still warm and start to pull it apart, the chocolate's gonna ooze like this. That's what's happened to these rocks in here. If you look at it, you can see that they're kind of like all facing the same direction, and some of them almost look like they've been stretched, because as that lava picked up these little pieces of rock, the rock got heated from that hot lava, but not enough to melt it. So it didn't become part of the lava, but it got pulled and stretched by the lava, which is how we know that there was once a volcano here in this area, which is kind of cool.
Does that mean every time when you see this kind of mark, that means it's lava created by?
Not necessarily. Not necessarily. I would not want to make it a blanket assumption that any time. But certainly when you see, I'm gonna bring you back to that question at our next site, because we're gonna see some rock that's embedded in other rock, and we're gonna compare it to how that looks to how this looks. Okay. But now that volcano was probably something like 580 million, somewhere between 500 and 600 million years ago. So that's really not what we're here to see. I just like to point out that kids don't necessarily think that there was once a volcano here, and now we know there was. But I do want to think about the forces that have been acting on this rock since it has been exposed at the surface. So I mentioned that the glaciers would have started in the northwest and moved towards the southeast. Geologists can tell this because they can look at the rock and see the effects the glaciers had on it. The glacier's going along and kind of tumbling along, picking up all this rock and loose debris, and then it hits a piece of rock that's still connected to the below. It's not moving this thing. This thing's permanently here. So it has to just kind of go up over the top of it. And I always do the sound effects. It's scraping up over the top. There's all those loose pieces of rock that are embedded in that ice, and so they're scraping along the top of this thing, and so it's smoothing it and scratching it at the same time. If you've ever done any woodworking and used like 60 grit sandpaper or really coarse grit, 80 grit sandpaper, you'll know that you can use it on wood and you'll smooth off the sharp edges, but you'll leave scratches in it. And then you use successively finer grains of sandpaper to make it smoother and smoother. Well, that's like our glacier. And so if you look, we'll see this more in another site, but you can almost start to see scratches in the rock that would have been from other rocks in that ice just being ground up over the top of this thing. But here's the thing. It goes up over the top, but then it doesn't just go oozing its way gently down the backside. It just goes full steam ahead in that direction. And so what would happen is you get the smoothing on the front side, but you'll often find that rocks on the back side would get plucked off the back. It didn't smooth the back, it plucks the back. So what might we expect to see on the back side of this rock? More rigid rocks? We're going to go find out. There is a page on abrasion and plucking. And that's what we're seeing here, and we're going to see it again at another site. So the glacier comes up, it smooths the front side, but the rocks on the back side just get plucked off and carried elsewhere. That gets us to the second of the terms that I'm going to share with you. We talked about weathering, those forces that wear down and break down rock. Erosion are the forces that carry those rock pieces someplace else. So now erosion has had its effect here and has carried those rock pieces someplace else. Now, we are going to climb up on the top of this rock. You may have noticed that when we were at Longfellow Pond, I brought us to that place where there was a juncture where the path goes up, and I gave you instructions to look at the material and the path on your way up. When you're doing this trip with kids, I will point out various places where it's a good idea just to, after they get out of the car, to bring them to gather in. Because if any of you have done had groups of kids in your car before, you know the moment the car door opens, it's like, whoa, we're free! All right, and there's this melee. So I recommend that you bring them someplace to kind of refocus their attention. St. Mary's is the one site where there's not really a good place to necessarily bring them to, but it is very important to note to students that we are in a cemetery and that we really do expect appropriate behavior. We are in contact with the church office that runs this cemetery, and teachers have been told to call the church office the day before the trip to make sure there's no internments planned for the day of the trip. If there is going to be one, we will skip this site. Oftentimes they'll tell us that, oh no, it's in the afternoon, you're fine, or no, it's on the other side of the cemetery, it's not a problem. They know we come here, they don't mind us climbing on the rock, they just ask that we be respectful, which is what we would want our kids to do. And certainly remind them not to muck around with the statues on the top of the rock. Now, because it has been raining and it's a little bit wet, this is going to be slightly slick. I would like us to look at something on the top of the rock because I think there's something really cool to see up there. So usually you can just kind of walk up, just use the cracks to walk up, and we're going to reconvene at the top of the rock.
I know exactly. Right, exactly.
What do you notice? A deep groove, shape. What might have caused this? What does it look like? Water. Can't you just imagine water pouring down this thing? And then I don't know about you, but I can just visualize it, if the water level's not very high, the water's running around either side of that, but then when it's higher, it goes over all of it. If you look over here, you'll see there's this area here where you can almost picture the water's going, whee, and kind of scooping around like this. Here, we've got this hole where perhaps a little pebble got in there and just got eddied around and started drilling a hole. So this clearly looks like water.
Fast water.
I'm sorry?
Fast water.
Fast water, exactly. Would a rainstorm do this? Fast running water had to do this. Now, what do we know about the direction water flows?
Up, down.
Downhill. So now here's a question. To make something like this, we would have had to have fast running water, so water would have been running fast downhill, and
The waterfall.
there's no high ground. It's gone. So here's another thing an analogy I'd like to make about geology. Someone once shared with me this idea. Imagine you take a novel like War and Peace, or one of those huge mega novels, and cut apart every single sentence. And then you take all those sentence strips, scramble them up, toss them in the air, throw away 2/3 of them, and now put the story back together. That is the study of geology. We have right here a sentence strip. We have to try to piece together the story that goes with that sentence. So, from this, we can infer what about this landscape at some point in its history.
there was some big glacier that
But not even necessarily a glacier. Remember, this was once part of a volcano. And in fact, if you look at the graphic of this, this is the part of the volcano. Geologists figure that this never even made it to the surface. So as you look at this, our little graphic, so we had the lava coming up, we had the lava spewing out. But over time, you notice this part that's circled here. Over time, the entire volcano has weathered and eroded away. And all that's left is this plug that was part of the chimney of that volcano. The rest of the volcano was here. That is now all gone.
And is that from a glacier that moved over it, or what?
No, this would have been over a course of millions and millions of years.
Okay.
I mean, this rock is, again, one of those rocks that is somewhere between 500 and 600 million years old. So somehow in the intervening 500 million years since then, it's all eroded away.
First comes volcano and then comes glacier.
Yes, again, remember, the glaciers were only like 2 million to 22,000 years ago. 22,000 as opposed to 600 million. That scope of geologic time is just so hard to get our minds around.
So this is all here before.
Well before the glacier.
Got it.
And then the glacier came along
this
and we
way.
could tell the direction it meant. And here again, you can start to see some of the scratches in the rock as we get up here. And the glacier smoothed the front side and plucked the rocks off the back side. So what other evidence is there that weathering or erosion is happening even now? What other things are acting on this rock now? The lichen, all right. So these green patches you notice are lichen. I mentioned earlier that there's mechanical weathering, which is the physical breaking apart of rocks. Water, ice, wind will do those things. There's also biological weathering, where living organisms will somehow break apart rock. If you look behind you, you'll see there's plants growing out of this rock. Well, those root systems can start to get into the rocks and break things apart. The third kind of weathering is chemical weathering, where there's actual chemical changes to the rock. Now, lichen is a living organism, but just as all living things, we take in the nutrients we need, and we have waste product. The waste product of the lichen is actually enzymes that can break apart the rock. So this, I mean, it's biological in the sense that it's living. It's also chemical in the sense that those enzymes are actually eating away at the rock. Make sense? All right. Now we have to somehow safely get ourselves back down and since it's wet, I used to like to go down that way, but since the poison ivy's taken over, I am going to kind of come down this way if we can help each other get down. This rock, I think, for the most part, it is a safe rock to come up, even when it's a little bit wet. But you definitely want to be mindful with the children, and don't take risks if you feel like if you see a dangerous situation, you don't have to. You can sort of see this from down below. But you can see why I like us to come up here, just to see this and the effects of that water had on this rock. It melted rocks like rock climbing. Yeah, they'll just fly down there. The tallest of those is about 1,300 feet high. A glacier could be up to a mile high, which would be 4 times the height of that radio tower. Here, at a minimum, it was several thousand feet high, so we've got multiple radio towers high of ice. All right, I want to point out just a little bit about this rock that's kind of interesting. Do you notice how along this bottom edge, it's a much different, like a lighter greener color than up here? Which do you think is the more natural color of this rock? What would it be? Down here? Why do you say that?
I think that's just the third color by some chemicals or whatever.
Exactly. Did everyone hear what she said? That this is kind of the natural thing, and this has just been influenced by chemicals or something. I don't know what it is, and I'm convinced this rock is a whole lot blacker than it used to be when I first started doing this trip. So the band down here is much more indicative of what the rock is really going to look like. Think about my 2 rock pieces I had before. One of them almost looked lighter than the other one. Well, that's just because of all the things that have happened to it over time. In this case, if we dig down and look at and expose rock that has never been exposed to the elements, it's much more likely to be this lighter color. What caused this blackness, I don't know. Maybe. I mean, and sometimes if you see rocks that have a reddish hue to them, it's because they've got a lot of iron in them, and it's actually rust. And that would be that chemical, kind of chemical weathering again. I was leaving this trip one day, and a person said that, oh yeah, that happened to my flagstones. And I was like, okay, say more. And she was talking to her landscaper, and there was a tree by these flagstones that apparently had some kind of insect that, as it was defecating, there was something in all that frass that was coming down that was eating away at her flagstones. So something has happened to this rock, but notice it's happening here, but then not so much here, but then over here, and not so much over there. Rock that is exposed to the surface is constantly undergoing the impacts of the natural forces around it. Now, why do you suppose this has now been, what might explain why we're now seeing this lighter band? What's probably happened to expose this rock? Did somebody come and dig it clear?
Yeah.
The ground has eroded, and you used your vocabulary word, so well done. Yes, to use the right term, eroded is that process of carrying away material. And I just want to kind of point out that in a lot of cases in science, there's one way that we use words in everyday language, like I have a theory about that, when it's not really a theory, a scientific theory. Likewise with weathering and erosion. Weathering is not about the weather, it's about those processes that wear down and break down rock. The erosion is the carrying away process. And if you think about beach erosion, it's the sand being carried away from the dunes. So just try to keep that in mind. Weathering are those forces that are breaking the things apart and wearing them down. Erosion are the forces that are carrying that material and moving it someplace else. Good? All right. Our next site is going to be Hemlock Gorge. Now, I am always so proud of the fact that we've got 5 sites of geologic interest all within the town of Wellesley. And the savvy amongst you may notice that this address here is now suddenly in Needham. We park in Needham. I promise you by the time we go to see the actual site, we will be back within the Wellesley town line.